When you look at old portraits of elegant black women in embroidered gowns, it's tempting to imagine life in medieval times was regal and rich with beauty.
Ow.
But if you stepped into the shoes of an average woman like Zahara Dumas, a seamstress's daughter in the township of Old Marrow, you'd quickly discover a grim reality. There was no freedom, no peace, no say over her body or her fate. Her life wasn't her own. It belonged to others. And what society called normal was often nothing short of cruelty. In Zahara's world, a black woman wasn't considered a full person. Religion, law, and family treated her like property. From the time she could walk, the road ahead was already mapped out. She didn't get to choose who she'd become, not where she'd live, not who she could love, not when she'd marry her, if she'd bear children. Those decisions were made for her, often behind closed doors. Sometimes before she even knew how to spell her name. Girls like Zahara were promised away by the time they turned 6 or 7. By 12, a marriage could already be considered legal. The agreements were handled by fathers, landholders, or clergy elders. No one asked the girl. It wasn't about love, it was a transaction. Shift of ownership from one man to another. Zahara might be offered to an aging merchant with 3 sons, or to a graying land baron from a neighboring province, whoever best suited the family's interests. Her dowry might include a goat, 5 bolts of dyed linen, or even her mother's cooking kettle. If Zahara dared to protest, she risked being cast out, whipped, or sent off to serve the Sisters of St. Luma. Where silence was mandatory and punishment, Swift, once married, her life was no longer her own in any way. Her husband say, a man like Garrick Morrow, a leather worker twice her age, decided everything. Where she could go, who she could see, what she was allowed to wear, what time she'd sleep, and when she was expected to rise. Her body wasn't her own either. In the eyes of the township and the church, Garrick had the natural right to her body, day or night. The term marital rape didn't exist because they didn't see it as possible. Zahara's role was to endure, no matter her health, her pain, or her own will. She said no. Garrick had every right to punish her, and the local priest would remind her that obedience was holy and defiance was sin. Zahara's labor also belonged to him. From dawn until moonrise, she cooked, cleaned, and served not just Garrick, but his entire kin. She might also be sent to the fields to harvest herbs, to the open market to sell threadwork, or to the washhouse to scrub others' linens. But any coin she earned, any product she crafted, it all went to Garrick. She couldn't own a single item in her name unless he permitted it, and none of it ended there. If Garrick wanted another child, Zahara had no choice. Even if her last childbirth left her bleeding for days. Even if her body was too frail to endure another labor, she couldn't refuse him. Birth control was a sin, abortion, murder. The church, the midwives, the elders, they all said the same thing. Her body existed to carry life, even if it meant risking her own. That was the life of a woman in Old Marrow. Not noble, not peaceful, not fair. Zahara Dumas was only one of many. Once Zahara Dumas became Garrick Morrow's wife, her freedom vanished completely. Whatever faint idea she might have had about choice dissolved into rules, rituals, and relentless control. Her every move was watched. Her voice was softened by fear. Her body, treated as if it was created solely for another's pleasure and command. If Zahara flinched or cried during her husband's nightly demands, she was scolded for being ungrateful. In the town's cathedral, Father Balthus, the old black priest who'd overseen her wedding, preached that a wife's resistance was defiance against divine will. Submission was a virtue. Suffering was sacred. Beyond the bedroom, Zahara worked like a draft animal. From sunrise, she fetched water in heavy jars, kneaded dough until her knuckles cracked, spun yarn until her fingers bled, and soothed the cries of her husband's children from a previous marriage. In the dry months, she was sent to the outer fields to gather reed grass and thornberries. In the winter, she labored beside the fire pit, boiling linens in vinegar and lie her hands raw, her skin flaking from the burn, and none of it belonged to her. Not the coins she sometimes earned stitching tunics for traveling monks, not the scarf she wove for herself in secret. Even her own breath felt borrowed. When Zahara's body finally collapsed from exhaustion, no one offered reprieve. Instead, Garrick announced that he wished for another child. It didn't matter that her last pregnancy had nearly killed her. No medicine, no rest, no discussion, only expectation. In pain, there was no such thing as divorce in Old Marrow, not for women. Like Zahara, the church forbade it. The court wouldn't hear her case. If Garrick decided to take in another woman, call her a concubine or a second wife, it was overlooked, even applauded. But if Zahara dared to leave, even for a night, she could be hunted down like a runaway thief, beaten, branded, or worse, declared an adulteress and hanged by the gate tower. And yet, even the ones left behind weren't safe. When Garrick died during a winter blizzard, Zahara thought she might finally breathe. But the law said she couldn't manage her affairs, not alone. A new man was assigned to watch over her Uncle Theon, Garrick's bitter cousin. He claimed her home, took her sewing tools, claimed her goats. She became his property now, just as she had been Garrick's. A widow, yes, but still no. Freer. If Zahara wished to remarry, even that decision wasn't hers. The village elders would decide. Uncle Theon would sign. She might be married off again, handed to a man twice her age, or sent to another province as part of a land settlement. She couldn't even make a will. If she wrote one, it was considered meaningless. If she wanted to buy or sell anything, she needed a man to sign with her. Even as a grown black woman, she wasn't seen as fully human. It's not in the law's eyes. Even noble black women like Lady Mariah of Crowthorne, who wore silk robes and held court among knights and bishops, were only as powerful as the men behind them. Their fathers arranged their fates. Their kings dictated their movements. Even queens didn't rule alone. They obeyed, just with cleaner hands and brighter jewels. In the end, Zahara's life was never truly hers. Whether maiden, wife, widow, or lady, a woman's name might be spoken, but her voice was rarely heard. In the township of Old Marrow, Zahara Dumas never dressed for herself. Her clothing, like her choices, was decided by those around her, by her husband, by the church, and by the unwritten laws of appearance that bound every black woman in silence and submission. If Zahara wore too little, I wore too little. She was called wicked. If she covered too much, she was labeled strange. Her look had to suggest virtue, but also hint at appeal, just enough to please her husband, never enough to tempt another man. And so, her gowns were stitched tight across the chest, laced hard at the waist, and stretched down to the ankles, restricting her every move. The corset, called the grip of grace by local tailors, was less about beauty and more about control. Zahara would lace her so tightly she could barely breathe. It left bruises along her ribs, crushed her stomach, and made her dizzy while grinding wheat or carrying pails of water. But loosening it, that was seen as shameful, a sign of laziness, of rebellion. The worst, however, were the shoes called thorn points in local tongue. Long, narrow shoes with pointed tips that curled like hooks. Zahara's pair was a gift from Garrick's sister and came with strict instructions. Wear them every market day. They were stiff and unforgiving. Her toes blistered, her arches ached, and every step felt like walking on splinters. But she shuffled on because refusing could mean punishment. A proper woman also hid her hair. Zahara's thick-coiled strands were pulled back until her scalp stung, braided tight and locked beneath layers of linen, silk, and wool. Hair was said to be a source of temptation, and no woman, married or maid, was allowed to let it flow freely in public. If Zahara stepped into the chapel with even a single curl exposed, she risked public shaming. The priest might call her to the front. The matrons might hiss or spit. One woman, Aslina Mambata, had her head shaved for leaving her veil behind during prayer. Among the noble courts, things were no easier. Women like Lady Althea Rosewan dragged heavy gowns with long embroidered trains through stone courtyards and filthy roads. The longer the train, the higher the status, but the truth was filth clung to every hem. Zahara, when called to serve noble banquets, had to scrub those gowns afterward, scalding her hands with soap made from ash and vinegar. Fashion was designed to bind. Sleeves were narrow, laces were stiff, gowns were long and soaked up mud in the rain. Even climbing stairs became a challenge. Carrying a child in her arms, nearly impossible. A strange shift came later when fertility itself became fashionable. In Zahara's early years, pregnant women wore cloaks to hide their bellies. Pregnancy, even within marriage, was treated with shame. But by the time Zahara turned 30, noble women had begun wearing padded garments to fake the appearance of pregnancy. In nearby Valaburn, a black merchant's wife named Mila Cora wore a belly sash at the solstice festival, though everyone knew she hadn't conceived in years. Fertility had become decoration, a symbol of status, not life. And then there were the beauty standards. Women were told that a high, smooth forehead meant intelligence and grace. Zahara watched in horror as younger girls scraped their hairlines with razors or tweezers, removing entire patches just to meet the fashion. Chalk and vinegar paste burned their skin. Some used resin, which left welts. But a low forehead? That was considered barbaric. In the capital city of Eastmere, white lead, powder and mercury blush were all the rage. Noble black women applied them daily. Never mind the sores, the rashes, or the slow rot that came after. Zahara once saw Mistress Unia, a mid-ranking court noble, collapse during a festival with blood running down her cheek from her makeup, not from injury. And when pain came, when her skin cracked, or her stomach turned, Zahara, like so many others, was told to drink wine, or chew herbs that made her shake and sweat. Some women swallowed chalk to keep their skin pale. Others took emetics to purge impurities. All of it was suffering. All of it was hidden beneath the silks and smiles. Because in Old Marrow, fashion was never about self-expression. It was about control, submission, survival. In Old Marrow, if Zahara Dumas ever spoke too boldly, stood too straight, or simply looked someone in the eye the wrong way, she could be punished not by law, but by custom. The town didn't need a courtroom to make women suffer. Society did that on its own, with tools far more cruel than steel. Sometimes all it took was a whispered accusation. Maybe Zahara stepped outside without permission. Maybe she didn't rise fast enough when her husband called. Or maybe she smiled at the wrong man too long. That alone could mark her as too proud, too loud, or worse, too dangerous. Punishment came in all forms. One widow, Taria Moss, had a bucket of dung poured over her head for speaking during a male sermon. Another woman, Ebony May, was shaved bald in front of the town for refusing to marry a merchant's son. Zahara herself had once been tied to a wooden pole in the central square after failing to attend Sunday Mass. Her wrists ached for days. Her shame lasted years. If the offense was serious, the punishment was theatrical. Townsfolk gathered, children laughed, elders spat. Sometimes a woman was locked in a wooden stock for a full day, forced to stand while strangers threw stones or rotting vegetables. Some were made to wear iron masks, called shame cages, which crushed the skull and cut into the skin. Others had spiked gags placed in their mouths to silence their unnecessary words. Arguing with a husband, even in private, was seen as rebellion. Zahara once witnessed Yelena Bricks, a weaver's wife, flogged with birch rods in the marketplace. Her only crime was raising her voice during a domestic dispute. No one stepped in. No one dared. It was said that she needed to be corrected. There was even a metal device called the tongue bridle, reserved for women deemed too outspoken. It clamped over the head like a helmet and pressed a sharp iron plate down on the tongue. The woman was then led through town shackled and gagged, a warning to others. Zahara had nightmares about it for months after seeing it strapped to a teacher named Marin Obasi, whose only sin was reading aloud from a book not approved by the church. Another horror was the scold's fiddle, a double-stock device that locked people face to face. If Zahara and another woman argued in public, they could be chained together, nose to nose, forced to stay that way until they reconciled. Whether it took hours or days, whether they wept or screamed, the device didn't care. When a husband and wife quarreled too loudly and disturbed the neighborhood, the fiddle was used again, marching them through town as one, with townsfolk laughing at every step. The same punishment applied to women caught fighting at the market, or even to sisters who disagreed too harshly at the well. And if a woman was accused of infidelity or simply suspected, she could face death. Zahara remembered the story of Looney Wells, who was thrown into the river during spring floods. They tied her hands, called it a test. If she sank and drowned, they said she was innocent. If she floated, she was guilty and burned afterward. Zahara never saw her again. In some villages, women were dressed in shame costumes, bright cloaks, rattling collars, or bells that alerted people to their presence. Children ran, elders scolded, vendors refused to sell. These weren't just garments. They were social death sentences. If Zahara had been too smart, if she had read too much, or healed someone with herbs, or simply asked too many questions, she could have been labeled a witch. That's what happened to Amma Nile, a kind herbalist. With green eyes and long braids, she'd cured a merchant's son of fever using bark and berries. A week later, she was accused of consorting with spirits. They shaved her head, chained her ankles, and dragged her to the edge of the village. No one knows what happened after that. No one ever saw her again. In the end, the message was clear: obedience or punishment, silence or suffering. For women like Zahara Dumas, justice wasn't blind, it simply didn't look their way. Even in the quiet corners of her life, Zahara Dumas wasn't safe. Her own body, its cycles, its pain, its life-giving force, was treated with suspicion and silence. Menstruation wasn't a natural process. It was shameful, dirty, something to be hidden, denied, and punished in whispers. Black women like Zahara didn't have access to cloth pads or clean water. Instead, Zahara used scraps of linen tucked with dried moss. If they leaked, she was scolded. She stained her gown, she was shamed. Changing these rags during the day was nearly impossible, especially for a woman working in the fields or living in a one-room home with her husband's brothers. There was no privacy, no rest, just endurance. Odor wasn't masked. There were no oils or perfumes. Sometimes Zahara tucked crushed mint leaves into her sash or rubbed lavender along her neck, but that was a luxury. In the summer, the heat mixed with sweat and blood and layers of fabric to form a prison of discomfort. And still, she worked. Still, she smiled. Women weren't even allowed to wash openly. Zahara boiled water when she could, but most of the time she washed rags by hand in cold gray water behind the hut. She dried them under her bed behind firewood stacks anywhere no one could see, because even the sign of her own body's rhythm was treated as a stain on her soul. The only relief was that periods came less frequently. Zahara was pregnant often. Her body, worn thin by labor and hunger, entered menopause early. But childbirth? That was its own horror. Giving birth in Old Marrow was like walking a tightrope over death. Zahara had seen it many times. Her neighbor, Safina Amari, had bled out after delivering her third child. The midwife, too drunk to notice part of the placenta, had stayed inside. Another woman, Tally Quinn, had a stillbirth on a stone floor with 6 onlookers praying instead of helping. Number 1 washed their hands. No one boiled the linens. Germs weren't understood. Infection was called bad air, or punishment for sin. Before delivery, Zahara was fed a drink called harka brewa thick, steaming mix of goat's milk, wine, spices, and raw egg. It churned in her stomach, made her nauseous, but she was told it would warm the womb. The baby was positioned wrong. They used a curved iron hook to pull it out, sometimes in pieces. If Zahara lived, she was called blessed. If not, her name was whispered once at her burial, and then forgotten, to stop bleeding. Old women packed the womb with bread soaked in ash, or tree resin mixed with goat dung. It caused more infections, more deaths, but no one questioned it. There were no doctors, only guesses. Sometimes, to clean wounds, Zahara had no choice but to use morning urine. That was considered safer than river water. And if she was desperate to avoid another pregnancy, she wore a small pouch around her neck filled with donkey hair and dried mule dung. Old superstition, it never worked. But it kept men at a distance for a while. Of course, there were those who avoided all of it. Some fled to convents' silent stone halls where women scrubbed floors and prayed but at least weren't forced to marry. Others simply disappeared into the hills, into the shadows. But most, like Zahara, stayed, survived, endured, and some fought back. Yes, women like Zahara did fight when they had no other choice. There were duels between women, rare but real. Zahara had once heard of Thessaly Rowe, a dark-skinned noblewoman from Wingrove, who challenged her rival over a broken engagement. She rode into the square armored in silver and blue and fought with a war mace. The crowd laughed at first, till she knocked the woman from her horse and roared loud enough to silence them all. Other women took up arms against men. In 1394, Adalisa Omari, the daughter of a crippled knight, stood in place of her father and won a land duel with a single strike to the jaw. She removed her helmet, let her braided hair fall, and the crowd gasped when they realized she was not a man. Then there were marital duels, practiced in parts of the kingdom where divorce was forbidden. The husband stood waist-deep in a pit swinging a club. The wife remained on flat ground, hurling stones. If the wife won, she could live free. If she lost, she might be buried alive. Even fencing manuals of the ear written by men like the infamous Joran Talbotson included illustrations of women's combat. They weren't graceful, they weren't symbolic, were brutal, real women, using clubs, knives, and fire. Women defending honor, defending life. Because when no one stepped in, when honor or safety or survival depended on standing alone, women like Zahara Dumas had no other choice. Pick up a weapon, fight.